Have you ever seen a child's painting change the course of someone's life? This story begins with a struggling, single dad, a little girl who paints what she dreams, and a mysterious woman who buys a roadside painting, only to return with a secret, a past, and a question that would change all their lives. It's not just about art, it's about memory, healing, and finding love when you least expect it, in a place you thought you'd left behind. And trust me, the ending? You won't see it coming, but your heart will thank you for staying. Before we begin, if stories of kindness, second chances, and unexpected love speak to you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. We've got more heartwarming stories just like this one waiting for you. Now, let's begin. Struggling single dad let his daughter sell art. She bought one, then came back to marry him. The morning sun hung low over the sleepy town of Maplewood, casting long golden rays through the pine trees lining the edge of County Road 14. The air still held the coolness of dawn, and a faint breeze stirred the wildflowers growing along the ditch. At a bend in the road, just outside a modest auto repair shop with a rusted sign that read Jake's Garage, a little girl was setting up a makeshift stand. Her name was Ava Carter, 8 years old, with honey blonde hair tied in 2 loose braids and a quiet determination in her eyes. She wasn't selling lemonade or cookies like most children might in the summer. No, Ava sold something far more unusual: her paintings. They were small, some no larger than a sheet of paper, but full of color and life. Rolling hills, sleepy barns, sun-dappled porches, and most recently, an old weathered house with ivy climbing up the walls and a red rocking chair on the porch. It was a place she said she saw in a dream. Inside the garage, Jake wiped his hands on a rag, peering through the dusty window at his daughter. He was a man of few words and fewer luxuries, in his early 40s with kind, tired eyes and the calloused hands of someone who'd spent most of his life fixing other people's problems under the hoods of their cars. The sleeves of his faded flannel shirt were rolled to the elbows, revealing strong forearms smudged with grease. He admired her, not just because she was his daughter, but because even after all they'd lost, she still carried light inside her. Ava carefully clipped her newest painting to the wooden easel they'd built together from old scrap. "What do you think, Daddy?" she asked as Jake stepped outside, shielding his eyes from the sun. Jake looked down at the picture. "That's a new one," he said softly. "Where'd you get the idea?" Ava tilted her head thoughtfully. "I dreamed about it. It felt peaceful, like a place where the wind sings and no one yells." Jake's heart pinched. Dreams like that didn't come from nowhere. They came from memories or the ache of wanting something more. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and nodded. "It's beautiful, kiddo. Someone's gonna see that and feel it too." Ava smiled proudly, then turned to organize her paint-stained paper bills in an old tin box. They had done this every weekend for the past few months, ever since Jake had picked up a second job at night and couldn't afford daycare during the day. He worried sometimes letting her sit out here by the roadside, but the townsfolk were kind, and Ava always insisted she was fine. "She's a little artist," old Mrs. Whitley from the bakery once said, "like she's painting from somewhere deeper than childhood." Jake wasn't sure what that meant, but he did know that Ava's art had a way of making people stop, and sometimes, if they looked long enough, smile. Later that morning, a sleek black Bentley glided down the road, the kind of car that didn't belong in Maplewood. The driver, a no-nonsense woman in sunglasses, looked straight ahead, but in the passenger seat, Savannah Monroe glanced out the window and frowned. "What was that?" she asked, already twisting in her seat. "Slow down!" The car pulled over just beyond the curve. Savannah stepped out, heels crunching against the gravel shoulder. The morning breeze tugged gently at her silk scarf as she walked back toward the little stand. Ava watched her approach, wide-eyed but polite. "Did you paint these?" Savannah asked, her voice cultured but not unkind. Ava nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Savannah's gaze swept over the display. Most of the paintings were sweet: countryside fields, animals, a sunrise over a hill. But one in particular made her chest tighten. She picked it up slowly. A pale blue house with peeling white shutters, ivy growing wild, a red rocking chair sitting crookedly on a porch. The details were too precise to be generic. It wasn't just a house, it was her grandmother's house, a place she hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. "This one?" Savannah said, staring intently. Where did you see it? Ava looked up, blinking. I didn't. I dreamed it. I woke up and painted it so I wouldn't forget. Savannah felt a chill despite the sun. Do you know where it is? Ava shook her head. No, but I think it's real. Savannah looked over her shoulder toward the garage where Jake stood now in the doorway watching. He looked cautious but not unfriendly. I'll take it, Savannah said, reaching into her purse. How much? Ava glanced at Jake. He nodded once. $10, Ava said proudly. Savannah handed her a 20. Keep the change. As she walked back to the Bentley, Savannah clutched the painting to her chest, her mind racing. That house had been gone from her life for so long, buried under bitterness, inheritance battles, and years spent chasing success. She wasn't sure she even wanted anymore. But how did a child she'd never met paint a place so exact, so hauntingly familiar? The driver asked, Everything okay, Ms. Monroe? No, Savannah whispered, sliding back into the seat. But I think it might be. She didn't look back as the car pulled away. But Jake did. He watched the sleek car disappear down the road, then turned to his daughter. What just happened? Ava shrugged. She looked sad when she saw the house. Jake nodded slowly. Yeah, people usually are when they recognize something they didn't expect to find. He ruffled her hair and went back to the garage. But part of him knew that woman wasn't just another customer. And that painting wasn't just a dream. Something had shifted. He just didn't know what yet. Savannah Monroe had always believed in logic, in structure, in things that made sense. That belief had carried her through Ivy League business school, late nights at corporate headquarters, boardroom negotiations, and endless interviews where she smiled on cue and gave the right answers. It had also built Monroe and Wild, her luxury fashion brand, loved by stylists and loathed by tabloids. Everything about her life was curated, controlled, and, as she often told herself, under her power. Until today. Until a child on the roadside handed her a painting of a house no one could possibly know. Savannah stared out the window of the Bentley as it sped along the open highway. The painting sat in her lap, wrapped in brown paper, but pulsing like a heartbeat. Her assistant Megan glanced over from the front seat, frowning. Savannah, you okay? I'm fine, she replied automatically, though her voice lacked conviction. Her gaze hadn't moved from the painting. I just need to think. Lettery. Megan exchanged a look with the driver, but said nothing more. Back at the lodge she'd booked, a discreet wood-frame resort hidden in the woods on the edge of town, Savannah excused herself from her assistant and headed straight for her room. She locked the door behind her, peeled away the paper, and held the painting up to the light. The colors were childlike, yes, uneven in places, edges bleeding slightly. But the structure, the layout, the soul of it was unmistakable. The front porch slanted ever so slightly to the left, just like it had after the heavy snowfall in '96. The single red rocker with the right armrest chipped, even the wild ivy creeping up the columns. She remembered pulling some down with her bare hands one summer, angry at the world, angry that her parents had dropped her off there like baggage, her grandmother's house, her refuge, her ghost. Savannah sank into the edge of the bed, breath shallow. It had been nearly 20 years since she'd last seen the place. After her grandmother's death, the house had sat vacant. Legal disputes within the family had dragged on for years, and Savannah, already deep into college, hadn't fought to keep it. What was one more memory buried? But seeing it again now, not in person, but through a child's eyes. It felt like the universe had shaken her by the shoulders. She tried to think logically. Maybe the girl had found an old photo online. Maybe she was from the area, or someone had described the house. Maybe. But Savannah knew there were no photos online. She'd made sure of that when she sold the property to a silent holding company for tax purposes. Even if the house still stood, it had long been scrubbed from the digital world. So how? Later that evening, Megan knocked and entered with dinner. Savannah barely touched it. Instead, she asked softly, Do you remember that place I told you about? My grandmother's house? Megan nodded slowly. The one in the countryside, where you used to hide out during the school year. Savannah turned the painting toward her. This is it. Megan took a step forward, then stopped. You mean the actual house? Yes. Savannah exhaled. Every detail, the porch, the windows, the rocker, even the vines, that girl painted it. Maybe her parents know something? Savannah shook her head. Her father was just a mechanic, honest, quiet, didn't seem to recognize me, and the girl said she dreamed it. Megan sat slowly on the arm of a nearby chair. That's eerie. Savannah looked down at the painting again. No, it's something else. Something I can't explain. For the first time in a long while, she didn't want to explain it. The next morning, Savannah woke before dawn. She dreamt of her grandmother. Not in the way people dream of the dead, but clearly like a memory caught in motion. Her grandmother had been sitting on the porch, brushing her silver hair, humming a hymn. Savannah had been a child again, watching from the steps. When she woke, tears clung to her lashes. She dressed simply. Jeans, a flannel shirt, boots not meant for showrooms. No makeup, no entourage. She told Megan to take the day off. I'm just going for a drive, she said. The road to Jake's garage looked different in morning light. Softer, more welcoming. The little stand was back, and so was Ava, sitting cross-legged on a faded blanket, paintbrush in hand. Jake stood near the open hood of a pickup, a wrench resting on his shoulder. Savannah pulled up in a more modest rental this time, a beat-up Ford she'd asked the lodge to arrange. She stepped out, unsure what to say. Ava looked up and beamed. You came back. Jake looked up too, blinking in surprise. Ms. Monroe, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Didn't expect to see you again. I wasn't planning to return, Savannah admitted, but that painting, it stirred something I didn't know I needed to face. Jake studied her face. She looked different today. Not polished, not guarded, just real. Did you remember something? She nodded. Everything. There was a long pause. Then Jake said, You're welcome to stay a while. We've got coffee inside. Nothing fancy, but it's strong. Savannah smiled. I'd like that. Ava grabbed her hand. I can show you my new painting. It's of a swing under a willow tree. Savannah's throat tightened. Her grandmother used to have just such a tree in the back field. She knelt. Did you dream this one too? Ava shook her head. No, I just felt it, like it wanted to be painted. Savannah looked over at Jake, who watched his daughter with a mix of pride and mystery. Like he still couldn't quite believe she was real. And maybe, Savannah realized, that's what this was all about. Somehow this little girl had painted her way through time, into Savannah's guarded heart, and found something she hadn't known was missing. Not just a house, not just a memory, but a doorway. To what? Savannah wasn't sure, but she was going to find out. Savannah hadn't planned on staying in Maplewood more than a few hours, but plans, she was quickly learning, had little weight when something deeper began to stir. She spent the night at the lodge again, though she hardly slept. The scent of pine through the open window, the hum of cicadas, even the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, it all pulled at her like threads from a forgotten tapestry. And that painting, still propped on the nightstand beside the bed, whispered to her each time she turned over in the dark. By morning, something inside her had shifted. Her fingers itched not for emails or business calls, but for something she hadn't felt in years. A pencil, a sketchbook, even a brush. The urge to create again, to feel. She hadn't picked up a brush since the week her grandmother died. At breakfast, she sipped lukewarm coffee and unfolded a worn road map she'd found in the lodge's library. She traced her finger along the thin gray lines of rural backroads, trying to find it. The house, the land, something to tether her memory to reality. Nothing. No street name, no listing. Just a blank patch near the creek, a bend in the road where her memory told her the house had once stood. She leaned back in her chair. It was there. She was sure of it. The swing, the old weather vane, the porch steps that groaned in the middle. Savannah could still feel the cool stone of the path under her bare feet. And Ava, that little girl with paint on her fingers and sunlight in her smile, had painted it down to the last vine-covered corner. Savannah wasn't a woman given to whimsy, but this defied coincidence. That afternoon, she returned to the garage. She didn't call ahead, just drove the bumpy road in her borrowed truck and parked by the familiar tree stump near the front gate. A blue jay darted from branch to branch above, as if trying to keep up with her steps. Jake was under the hood of a Chevy when she arrived, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, grease along his forearms. He looked up, startled for just a moment before nodding in quiet acknowledgement. Savannah approached slowly. "Hi, didn't think I'd see you again," Jake said, standing upright, wiping his hands on a rag. "Especially not in that truck." She smiled. "Trying to blend in. You're doing a decent job, though the boots are a little clean." She glanced down, laughed softly. "Noted." He offered her a water bottle from the cooler beside the shop, and they sat on a couple of crates near the shade. Ava was nowhere to be seen, likely off in her imaginary world again, painting some memory that wasn't hers and yet somehow was. "I've been trying to find the house," Savannah said after a long pause. "The one she painted." Jake nodded. "Used to be something like it on Cedar Creek Road, way out past the bridge where the pavement turns to gravel." Savannah's breath caught. "That's it." He studied her face. "Your family's?" "My grandmother's." She looked down. "I haven't been there in decades. I thought the house had been sold, maybe torn down, but that painting, it felt like someone reached into my past and handed it back to me." Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he handed her a clean napkin and gestured toward the water bottle in her hand. She hadn't even realized she was gripping it so tightly. "I don't know what your story is, Ms. Monroe," he said gently, "but I do know this town has a funny way of remembering what people try to forget." Shdikinum. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the wear in his eyes, the careful kindness of someone who'd carried more than his share. "Call me Savannah," she said quietly. That evening, she followed Jake's directions out past the edge of town. The road narrowed until it was barely more than a gravel path framed by tall grass and wild thistle. Every bend in the road seemed to echo with memory. The time she'd scraped her knee climbing the fence, the way the rain sounded against the tin roof, her grandmother humming hymns in the kitchen as she baked cornbread. And then, through a break in the trees, she saw it. The house was still there, leaning now, worn by weather and time, the white paint flaking from the shutters like dried petals. But the shape was unmistakable. The porch sagged. The red rocker was gone. Vines had claimed the outer walls, threading through the lattice and crawling up the eaves. But it was real. Savannah pulled over and stepped out, gravel crunching beneath her boots. The sun was dipping low, casting the house in amber light. It looked abandoned. Yes, forgotten. But not unloved. She stepped onto the front path, weeds brushing her jeans. The wooden steps groaned as she climbed them, just like she remembered. The front door hung slightly open. Inside, dust motes floated like spirits. The air was thick with the scent of age. Wood, mildew, and something floral that clung to memory like perfume. Savannah wandered through the kitchen, the faded wallpaper peeling in places. She ran her fingers over the window frame, then paused at the dining room wall, scratched faintly into the paint, her initials. SM, a childish hand, crooked and proud. She swallowed hard. How had Ava seen this? How had that little girl captured the soul of this place? A place even Savannah had tried to lock away. And then, as if drawn by something deeper, she wandered into the back room. The sunlight fell in just the way she remembered, casting golden bars across the floor. There, tucked into a drawer of the old side table, was a small, brittle envelope. She picked it up carefully. Her name was written in her grandmother's handwriting. Savannah, for if you ever come home. Her hands trembled. She didn't open the letter until she was back at the lodge, sitting in the quiet glow of a single lamp. The paper crackled as she unfolded it. "My darling girl, if you're reading this, it means you've come back. I always believed you would. I know the world tried to take parts of you. I just hope it never took your kindness. This house was never meant to be sold. It's meant to be a place you can always return to. If your heart is tired, let these walls hold you. If your dreams are broken, paint them again. Love always, Grandma Clara." Savannah pressed the paper to her chest and wept, not the tears of grief, but of release, like something long dormant had been touched. Not broken, just waiting. The next morning, Savannah stood at the foot of the old porch again. The sky was overcast. the kind of soft gray that made everything feel muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The house hadn't changed overnight, but Savannah had. Something in her had cracked open, something she'd kept tightly sealed for years behind deadlines, titles, and curated perfection. Now, standing before her grandmother's house with mud on her boots and wind in her hair, she didn't feel like Savannah Monroe the brand. She felt like Savannah the granddaughter, the girl who once climbed trees barefoot and fell asleep to the sound of crickets through a screen window. She lingered for a moment longer, then turned and walked back to the truck. It was time to return to town. At Jake's garage, the rhythm of the day had already begun. The clang of tools, the steady hum of an idling engine, and the occasional bark of the neighbor's old hound dog provided the familiar soundtrack. Jake was bent over the hood of a rusted Ford Bronco, deep in concentration, while Ava sat cross-legged nearby on the sidewalk, sketching something intently. Savannah pulled in and stepped out, carrying a small box wrapped in a canvas cloth. She wore jeans again, more worn this time, and her hair was pulled into a low ponytail. The air smelled like motor oil and honeysuckle. Ava looked up first and grinned. "You came back," Savannah smiled. "I told you I would." Jake straightened slowly, wiping his hands. "Morning," he said, not quite surprised but curious. "I brought something," Savannah said, holding out the box. "For Ava." The little girl's eyes widened as she untied the cloth. Inside was a set of professional-grade watercolors, soft brushes, and thick-textured paper. The kind artists used when they weren't just playing, but creating. Ava looked up, stunned. "These are real artist paints." Savannah knelt beside her. "You are a real artist, Ava." Jake shifted, uncomfortable but touched. "That's very generous." Savannah stood, brushing dust from her knees. "It's not generosity, it's gratitude. Your daughter reminded me who I was before I became everything else." He studied her. "You look different today." "I feel different." They sat on the bench beside the shop while Ava painted nearby, her brow furrowed in focus. "I went back," Savannah said quietly. Jake turned his head. "To the house?" She nodded. "It's still standing?" "Barely, but it's there." "Must have brought back some things?" "It did." She glanced at him. "And some people." Jake didn't pry. He simply waited, as people in small towns tend to do, allowing silence to do what words often couldn't. "I found a letter," Savannah continued, voice soft. "My grandmother left it for me. She knew I'd come back someday." Jake was quiet for a long beat. "Funny how they know, even when we don't." Savannah looked over at Ava, who was now mixing colors with intense precision. "She said something else." Jake raised an eyebrow. "She said this house was never meant to be sold. It was supposed to be a place I could always return to." Savannah inhaled deeply. "I think I want to fix it up." Jake gave a small, surprised nod. "It's a big job." "I'm not afraid of work." "No, I suppose not." She looked at him. "I don't know what I'm doing, Jake. I'm not here to build a new brand or chase another headline. I want to find out who I am without all of it." Jake leaned back on the bench, arms crossed loosely. "Well, Maplewood's not in a hurry. It'll let you figure it out." She smiled, grateful for the steadiness in his tone. Over the next few days, Savannah began a quiet ritual. Each morning, she'd visit the house and walk its creaky halls, making notes of what needed repair, what could be salvaged, what memories rose where. And in the afternoons, she'd return to town and linger near the garage, talking to Ava, sharing old stories, sometimes sitting with Jake on the porch with chipped mugs of strong coffee. She didn't push, and neither did he. There was a kind of grace in the space they shared, the unsaid understanding between two people who had learned to survive by not expecting too much. But little by little, their walls softened. One afternoon, Jake showed up at the old house with a toolbox and a quiet offer. "You'll need help rebuilding the porch," he said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Savannah didn't answer right away. Instead, she smiled and opened the front door wide. In the evenings, Savannah would sketch again. Nothing elaborate, just quick impressions. A corner of the old kitchen, the sway of the porch swing that was no longer there. Ava's hands as they held a paintbrush steady. She hadn't realized how much she missed the feeling of paper beneath her fingers, of creating without judgment. One night, as she flipped through her sketches, She found herself staring at one she hadn't remembered drawing. It was of Ava sitting under the willow tree behind the house, sunlight dappling her shoulders. And standing behind her, slightly out of focus, was Jake, sleeves rolled up, watching over her with that quiet, unspoken tenderness he never voiced aloud. Savannah's fingers hovered over the page. That, she realized, was the moment she had started to feel something she didn't yet have words for. One morning, as Savannah helped Ava mix colors for a sunset sky, the little girl looked up with serious eyes. "Why did you stop painting before?" Savannah paused, caught off guard. "Because I forgot why I started." "Why did you start?" Savannah looked at her, then at Jake, who was wiping down a wrench nearby. "I wanted to feel something real," she said softly. Ava nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Then you should never stop again." As Savannah walked back to her truck that afternoon, she turned and looked at the shop, the little roadside stand, the girl with paint on her jeans, and the man who said so much with so little. This wasn't just returning to the past. This was stepping into something new, something unknown. And for once, Savannah wasn't afraid. The road to Cedar Creek twisted like an old ribbon, narrowing with every mile. Gravel crunched beneath Jake's tires as his pickup rolled through dense groves of maple and oak, branches forming a quiet cathedral overhead. Savannah sat in the passenger seat, hair tucked beneath a baseball cap, her boots muddy from a morning spent clearing brush behind the porch. She had insisted on riding along, not just to see the lumberyard they were sourcing supplies from, but because something about driving through those familiar woods soothed her in ways she hadn't expected. Jake drove with one hand on the wheel, his posture relaxed. "It's been years since I came this way. Used to be an old logging road up past that bend." Savannah nodded, eyes fixed on the trees passing outside the window. "These woods feel the same, like they're watching you, but not in a bad way. Like they're remembering." Jake glanced sideways, a faint smile forming. "Most people from the city don't talk about trees like that." "I'm not most people," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "You're not." They spent the rest of the day gathering lumber, salvaging weathered boards, and picking out hardware that would match the old farmhouse's bones. Jake showed her how to test beams for rot and how to read the grain of reclaimed wood. Savannah watched, asked questions, took notes, eager to learn not out of necessity but out of reverence. That evening, back at the house, they stood on the porch overlooking the field where the swing had once hung from the willow tree. Savannah stepped forward, gaze fixed on the overgrown yard. "That's where it used to be," she murmured. "The swing?" Jake asked. She nodded. "It was red, faded but solid. My grandmother used to push me for hours. That's where I told her I wanted to be an artist." He looked at her thoughtful. "And what did she say?" Savannah smiled, voice low. She said, "Then don't let the world change your mind, sweetheart. Let your art change the world." Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sounds like a woman who knew things." "She did," Savannah replied. "She just never said them unless you were listening." The wind rustled the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of honeysuckle and thyme. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the porch. "I found something else," Savannah said, her voice barely louder than the breeze. "Yesterday in the attic." Jake raised an eyebrow. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of yellowed paper. She handed it to him carefully. It was another letter, written in the same soft cursive as the one she had first discovered. "To the one who still remembers, this house holds more than your memories. It holds your beginning. You came here in pieces once. You'll come back again whole if you let yourself. Let love in, Savannah, even when it scares you." Jake read it twice before folding it neatly and returning it. His voice was steady. "She really left these for you?" Savannah nodded. "I think she knew I'd need them. Not right away, but someday." Jake leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed loosely. "So why now?" She looked up at him. "Because a little girl painted a dream she shouldn't have known, and because you gave her the space to believe it mattered." Their eyes held for a moment longer than either of them expected. Then Savannah stepped back, clearing her throat. "Anyway, tomorrow's porch demolition day?" Jake chuckled. "Should I bring a crowbar or a priest?" She grinned. "Both, probably." The next morning, Savannah arrived early. She wore a bandana to keep the dust out of her hair, her sleeves rolled high, hammer in hand. Jake had already begun loosening the rotted floorboards, and by mid-morning, the two of them were working in quiet rhythm, sweat gleaming on their foreheads, the house groaning under the release of decades-old nails. Ava sat on a nearby rock, painting, as she often did, with quiet intensity. Today she was focused on a swirling sky of oranges and lavender. "What are you painting?" Savannah asked, pausing to take a sip from her thermos. Ava looked up, eyes wide. "The house, but how it wants to be." Jake set down his crowbar. "How it wants to be?" "Uh-huh." Ava tilted her head. "Not how it is, how it remembers." Savannah knelt beside her, peering at the image. The windows were lit from within, warm golden glows. The swing had returned, and vines bloomed with soft pink flowers she didn't recognize. And on the porch there were three figures: Savannah, Ava, and Jake. Savannah blinked. "That's lovely, Ava." The girl shrugged, matter of fact. "That's just what I see." Jake glanced over but said nothing. Later that evening, Savannah stood alone in the kitchen of the old house, tracing the outline of the window frame with her fingertips. The walls still bore the faint outlines of old wallpaper, flowers now faded and curling at the edges. She could almost hear the clatter of dishes, the laughter of her grandmother humming off key. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of hope, of the strange in-between where past and present hovered like dust in sunlight. She turned and found Jake in the doorway, a quiet steadiness in his frame. "Want a drink?" he asked, holding up a bottle of sweet tea. She nodded. They sat on the steps outside the porch, the stars beginning to prick through the indigo sky. "I don't know what this place is going to be yet," she said softly. "It might be home. It might just be a chapter." Jake took a sip. "Either way, it's a good one." Savannah looked at him. "You ever think about leaving?" "Used to," he admitted. "After Lila passed. Thought about it a lot. But then Ava needed roots. And maybe I did too." Savannah nodded, her voice almost a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if we build walls thinking we're protecting ourselves, and all we're doing is keeping good things out." Jake didn't answer right away. When he did, it was simple. "Then maybe it's time to let the good things in." She looked at him, really looked, and in his quiet eyes she saw no judgment, no expectation. Just the patience of someone who understood grief, understood rebuilding, and had learned to keep showing up anyway. It was the beginning of something, fragile, uncertain, but real. And Savannah, for the first time in years, wasn't running from it. She was walking straight toward it. The last board came loose with a groan and a cloud of dust. Jake tossed it into the growing pile and leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. The sun was high now, casting sharp shadows along the front yard of the farmhouse, where Savannah stood surveying the exposed beams of the porch. They had worked all morning, side by side, without much talking. The kind of silence that was filled not with tension, but with rhythm. The kind people fall into when they trust each other without needing to explain why. Savannah stood with her hands on her hips, cheeks flushed from heat and effort, her hair pulled into a messy knot that had long since stopped resembling anything fashionable. She looked down at the beams. "Solid," she said. "Surprisingly." Jake nodded. "Your grandmother built things to last." Savannah smiled faintly. "She built people to last." Ava, sitting under the shade of the old oak with her paints, looked up. "Is it going to be a porch again?" Jake grinned. "Better than ever." Later that afternoon, Savannah returned to town alone. Jake had insisted she take a break. "You're not used to all this hammer swinging," he'd said, only half teasing. She stopped by the local diner, one of the few places in Maplewood that hadn't changed in decades. Vinyl booths, a jukebox that never quite worked, and waitresses who remembered your name even if you didn't live there. Savannah sat by the window, sipping sweet tea and watching a boy ride his bike down the sidewalk, a bag of groceries swinging from his handlebars. This town had a pulse all its own, slow, honest, alive. She'd spent so long in boardrooms and glass towers, making decisions that echoed through spreadsheets but never touched real lives. But here, in Jake's quiet glances, in Ava's paintings, in the soil beneath her grandmother's porch, everything felt rooted, real. She pulled out her phone, instinctively checking emails, then stopped. Her inbox was full. Missed calls, press inquiries, investor questions. people wondering where Savannah Monroe had gone. She stared at the screen, then powered it off. Let them wonder. That evening, she returned to the garage with a box of Ava's favorite cookies from the bakery. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting everything in a golden haze. She found Ava sitting on a stool, swinging her legs while Jake worked on an old truck. "Special delivery," Savannah said, setting the box on the table. Ava lit up. "Snickerdoodles." Jake gave her a grateful smile. "You're spoiling her." "She deserves it," Savannah replied. "She's the one who brought me back here." Jake looked at her then, a long, steady look that said more than he was ready to say out loud. They ate cookies under the soft whir of a standing fan, the kind that rattled when it turned. Ava babbled about her new painting, a field of wildflowers with a sky full of birds, while Jake and Savannah sat in companionable silence. Eventually, Ava excused herself to wash up, and Jake turned to Savannah. "You're staying longer than you planned." She nodded. "I think I stopped planning the day I saw that painting." Jake leaned back against the workbench, arms crossed. "And what about your life back in the city?" Savannah hesitated. "It's still there. Waiting, I guess." "You gonna go back?" "I don't know." He didn't push, just waited, like he always did. Savannah glanced at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why don't you date?" Jake blinked. The question had come out softer than expected, but it hung in the air nonetheless. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Wasn't much time. Raising Ava, it's a full-time life. And after Lila passed, I wasn't sure I had anything left to give." Savannah nodded slowly. "But you do." Jake met her eyes, something shifting in his gaze. "And what about you? All those articles. The billionaire fashion mogul with the perfect life. Why'd you walk away?" She hesitated. "Because it wasn't perfect," she said finally. "It was polished, controlled, lonely." Jake didn't flinch. "And now?" Savannah looked down, then up again. "Now I feel unfinished, in a good way." A long pause passed between them, not awkward, but heavy with possibility. Then the door to the garage creaked open, and Ava skipped back in, interrupting whatever had been about to unfold. Jake rose, patting his hands on his jeans. "Come on, Squirt. Time to close up." Savannah lingered a moment longer before walking out with them into the fading light, but the quiet wouldn't last. The next morning, a sleek black SUV pulled up outside the farmhouse. Savannah was in the backyard clearing debris when the vehicle rolled to a stop, its tinted windows gleaming. She stood frozen as the door opened, and a sharply dressed man stepped out, phone in hand. "Ms. Monroe," he said crisply, "you've been hard to reach." Savannah exhaled slowly. Patrick Wolf, her company's chief operating officer, and more accurately, the man who had kept the empire afloat in her absence. He looked around distastefully. "This place isn't exactly what I'd call corporate ready." "It's not meant to be," Savannah replied coolly. Patrick lowered his sunglasses. "We have meetings lined up in New York, press appearances, investor pitches. The team's been scrambling to cover for you." "I didn't ask them to." "You didn't ask anything, Savannah. You just vanished." She crossed her arms. "I needed space." Patrick's voice dropped, more cautious now. "Look, I get it. You needed a break, but if you're trying to pull some kind of media stunt—" "I'm not," she said firmly. "This isn't a stunt. It's my life." He blinked. "You're staying here?" "For now." Patrick looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You know the board's nervous. They're already talking about succession plans. Let them." He stared at her for a moment longer, then gave a short laugh. "You've changed." Savannah didn't answer. As the SUV pulled away, she stood motionless, the dust curling around her boots. Jake arrived minutes later, concern etched on his face. "You okay?" Savannah nodded, but her expression was distant. "Someone from your other world?" he asked gently. "Yes." Jake hesitated. "You thinking of going back?" Savannah turned to him, her voice steady. "I think, for the first time in my life, I'm thinking of staying." The wind began whispering through the trees just after noon, a low, uneasy rustle that set the leaves trembling and made the hanging chimes on the porch of Jake's garage tremble like nerves before confession. Savannah stood beneath the awning of the old house, a roll of blueprints in her hands, staring at the clouds forming in the west. They rolled in low and dark, like heavy thoughts arriving uninvited. She pulled her phone from her pocket, the one she had barely used in weeks, and checked the weather app. Tornado watch, heavy rainfall, possible flash flooding. Maplewood wasn't a town of panic, but it respected nature. When the storms came through these backwoods, they came with teeth. By the time she reached the garage, the wind had picked up. Jake was already moving through the shop, rolling down doors, securing equipment. "You heard?" she asked, stepping inside. Jake nodded. "Radio says it's moving fast. Could hit by early evening." Ava was sitting on the counter with her backpack, hugging a stuffed rabbit. "Daddy said I can't stay at home. He said the trees are too close." Savannah nodded, offering her a smile. "He's right. This building's sturdier." "You can stay with us," Jake said without looking up. "Safer than that old farmhouse right now." Savannah hesitated. She hated the idea of leaving the house behind, especially now that it had started to feel like something she could claim again. But Jake was right. The structure was old and the trees loomed over it like watchers with uncertain tempers. "Thanks," she said, brushing hair from her face. "I'll go grab a few things and be right back." The rain started as she reached the farmhouse. Not a drizzle, a sudden sharp sheet that slapped against the windshield and turned the dirt road into mud. She parked as close to the porch as she could and ran inside, grabbing what she could in 5 hurried minutes. Her sketchbook, the 2 letters from her grandmother, a change of clothes. As she turned to leave, she paused by the kitchen window. Through the glass, lightning illuminated the field behind the house. For a moment it looked like the swing had returned to the willow tree, just for a flicker, swaying on its own in the wind. Back at the garage, Jake had turned the main workspace into a makeshift shelter. Blankets, lanterns. A battery-powered radio crackled from a workbench. Ava was curled on a sleeping bag with her rabbit and a stack of books. Savannah arrived drenched and breathless. Jake handed her a towel, his brow furrowed with silent concern. "Bad out there?" "Coming down sideways," she said, stripping off her soaked jacket. Jake nodded and offered her a thermos of coffee. "We'll ride it out here." The storm rolled in with fury. Wind howled like something ancient, and rain slammed against the tin roof like thousands of tiny fists. The power flickered once, then failed entirely, plunging the space into soft, flickering lantern light. They sat together in the center of the shop, Savannah, Jake, and Ava, wrapped in quilts, with the scent of oil and rain mixing into something strangely comforting. Ava had fallen asleep against Savannah's side, and for a long time neither adult spoke. Then Savannah whispered, "I don't remember the last time I sat still long enough to just listen." Jake glanced over. "To what?" "The storm, the quiet between the noise." Jake looked down at Ava's peaceful face. "Sometimes the in-between is where the truth is." Savannah turned to him, her voice low. "You're good at this." He raised an eyebrow. "At what?" "Making people feel safe, steady." Her voice caught slightly. "I forgot what that felt like." Jake didn't look away. "And what do you feel now?" She met his eyes. "Like maybe I could remember how to trust again." The wind shrieked above them, but inside the garage there was only stillness, a different kind of shelter. Jake didn't reach for her hand, didn't close the space between them, but in the glow of the lantern, his expression softened. Not in pity, but in recognition. 2 people who had lost. 2 people still choosing to stay open anyway. An hour later, the storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived. The radio murmured updates about the path of the front, now moving east. Power lines were down, trees across roads, but no reported injuries. Jake stirred the fire in the old wood-burning stove near the back of the shop while Savannah covered Ava with another blanket. "She sleeps through anything," Jake murmured with a smile. "She trusts you," Savannah replied. "That kind of peace only comes from being loved right." He looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "You know you don't have to leave, right?" Her breath caught. "I mean," he continued, "when this is over, when the repairs are done. You've been acting like there's an expiration date on being here." Savannah stared at the glowing embers in the stove, then back at him. "Because I've never been anywhere people wanted me to stay. They needed me, sure, for business, for headlines, for what I could provide, but not just me." Jake's voice was gentle. "Then maybe this is your first time." The room fell quiet again, But it was a different kind of quiet now, one thick with emotion, with possibility. Ava stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about the swing. Savannah smiled. She keeps painting that tree. Jake nodded. She says it's supposed to come back. Savannah tilted her head. Maybe we should build it. For her. Jake hesitated. Not just for her. I mean, their eyes met in the low light, and in that moment, Savannah understood something she hadn't dared to admit before. She didn't just want to rebuild her grandmother's house. She wanted to rebuild something inside herself. Something fragile, something hopeful. And maybe, just maybe, Jake and Ava were part of that foundation. The storm had knocked out the world outside, but inside that garage, something had come alive. Quiet, steady, and just beginning. A different kind of weather, a different kind of home. Savannah had forgotten how loud silence could be after a storm. The morning after, the skies over Maplewood stretched wide and clear, scrubbed clean by the night's violence. Branches littered the roads and puddles sparkled in the ditches, but the air was crisp with that unmistakable scent of pine, rain, and fresh beginnings. At Jake's garage, the storm's debris had already been mostly cleared. Jake had been up at dawn, not because he had to, Savannah suspected, but because men like him didn't know how to be still when something needed fixing. Savannah stood by the garage entrance, sipping from a tin mug of strong black coffee, watching him work. He moved with quiet purpose, his presence grounding, like a rock in the middle of a shifting current. Ava sat nearby with her sketchbook, humming as she painted what looked like a glowing barn under a starlit sky. For a moment, Savannah let herself believe this was her life, that she belonged here, with chipped mugs and quiet mornings and a man who made her feel seen without ever asking her to perform. But good things, she knew, rarely went unchallenged. It happened just after noon. A sleek, unfamiliar car rolled up to the garage, silver, polished, with rental plates and tinted windows. It didn't belong. Not here, not now. The door opened, and out stepped a woman in heels that clicked too sharply on the gravel. Her blazer was tailored, her earrings small and expensive. And on her face was the one thing Savannah recognized instantly: the look of someone who was used to being in charge. "Savannah," the woman called, walking briskly toward her. "Finally." Jake looked up from under the hood of a truck. Ava's painting stopped mid-stroke. Savannah stiffened. "Charlotte." Charlotte Vale, head of Monroe and Wild's PR division, and the very last person Savannah expected, or wanted, to see in Maplewood. "What are you doing here?" Savannah asked, her voice measured but tight. Charlotte didn't lower her voice. "I flew in last night. The board is panicking. Your name is back in the headlines and not in the way we like." Savannah frowned. "What headlines?" Charlotte pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. "Billionaire heiress living like a local. Romance rumors in small-town America," she read aloud, then turned the screen for Savannah to see. "And that's one of the nicer ones." Savannah blinked at the image. It was a candid, her and Jake on the porch of the farmhouse 2 days ago. She was laughing. He was handing her a tool. The intimacy was unmistakable. "I didn't know anyone was watching," she said quietly. Charlotte arched a brow. "Savannah, you vanished. No warning, no statement. And now you're restoring some old house with a mechanic and his kid? You think the press isn't going to devour that?" Behind her, Jake set down the wrench. His expression was unreadable, but Savannah felt his gaze like a weight on her shoulders. She swallowed. "This wasn't planned." "I can tell," Charlotte replied. "That's the problem." Later, in the back office of the garage, Savannah closed the door and stood in front of Jake, who remained seated on the edge of his workbench, arms crossed. "So," he said, "you're a billionaire heiress." Savannah winced. "Technically, yes, but that's not the whole story." He said nothing. "I didn't mean to lie," she added. I needed space. Time to figure out who I am without all of it. I didn't expect anyone to follow me here." Jake looked up. "And what do you want us to do with that? Pretend like it doesn't change anything?" She faltered. "Does it?" Jake didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You walked into our lives as someone else, and we let you in. Ava painted you into our future. And now we find out the woman teaching her how to hold a brush runs a global fashion empire?" Savannah's voice cracked. "I didn't come here to manipulate anyone." Jake stood. No, but you hid. And maybe it was easier for you that way. She stepped closer. I didn't know how to tell you. You didn't trust us enough. The words landed harder than she expected. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Jake shook his head slowly. Look, I don't care about your bank account. I care about my daughter. And right now she thinks the woman who made her believe in magic might walk away because some fancy people in suits showed up. Savannah's eyes welled. I never wanted to hurt her. Then don't, he said simply. Figure out what you're doing, Savannah. Because if this was just a detour for you, don't let her hope it's forever. Savannah didn't go back to the farmhouse that night. Instead, she checked into the lodge, the very place she had first stayed when arriving in Maplewood. It felt colder now, less alive. She stood in the center of the room, the painting Ava had gifted her in her hands. The one of the old house under stars with 3 figures standing on the porch. 3. She traced the figures with her finger and let the tears fall freely this time. The next morning she rose before dawn and drove, nowhere in particular, just far enough to feel the hum of the road under her tires and the ache in her chest grow louder. She pulled over on a hilltop just as the sun broke over the treetops. The light spilled golden and soft across the fields, touching the world with forgiveness. And she sat there, alone, finally honest with herself. She had come to Maplewood thinking she needed distance from her life. What she found was the part of herself she'd long forgotten. The girl who used to paint beside her grandmother, who dreamed without permission, who loved without armor. And that girl didn't want headlines. She wanted roots. Later that afternoon she returned. To the house, to the porch, to the place she feared she might have lost. Ava was sitting there alone this time, knees pulled up to her chest. When she saw Savannah, she didn't run. She just looked, quietly, expectantly. Savannah sat beside her. I'm sorry. Ava looked down. Daddy says you're famous. I was, Savannah said softly. Maybe I still am, but that's not the part I care about anymore. Ava fiddled with her bracelet. Are you leaving? Savannah looked her in the eye. Not unless you want me to. A long pause, then a small voice. I don't. Savannah exhaled, tears rising again. Then I'll stay. Ava leaned into her, head resting on Savannah's shoulder. Savannah looked up and saw Jake in the doorway, watching. He didn't speak, but this time he didn't turn away. The first thing Jake noticed was the silence, not the kind that echoed after an argument or the brittle hush of disappointment, but something gentler, like the moment between chords in a well-played song. Savannah hadn't come back to the garage after the confrontation with Charlotte. Not that day, not the next. And though Jake didn't say it aloud, the absence hung over everything like the scent of rain on wood, impossible to ignore, even when it faded. Ava felt it too. She stopped asking when Savannah would come paint with her. She still hummed while she drew, still climbed into Jake's truck with a bounce in her step. But the spark behind her questions, the wonder, had dimmed, until the morning she brought him a new painting. They were in the kitchen, a lazy Sunday unfolding with scrambled eggs and toast. Ava had vanished after breakfast and returned with a canvas tucked behind her back. Daddy, she said, biting her lip, I painted something. Jake turned from the sink, towel slung over his shoulder. Let's see. She held it up like a secret waiting to be told. It was the farmhouse, but not as it was. This version showed the porch restored, fresh white beams and a swing with red cushions. The garden bloomed with flowers that hadn't been planted yet. Tulips, lavender, peonies. Light poured from every window, and under the willow tree stood 3 figures. The child was Ava, unmistakably. The woman wore a sundress and had long brown hair, slightly windblown. And beside her was a man in a flannel shirt, his hand resting protectively on her back. Jake studied the painting for a long moment, his throat tightening. It's beautiful, he said finally. Ava watched him carefully. I dreamed it again. She was there. She wasn't gone. He crouched to her level. Do you think she'll come back? Ava nodded. She already is. That afternoon, Jake drove to the farmhouse. The rain from earlier in the week had softened the road, making the path muddy but passable. When he reached the house, he found the porch empty, the wind stirring the hanging chimes Savannah had put up before the storm. The swing still hadn't been rebuilt, but the hooks were in place. He knocked on the door, not expecting anyone to answer. She wasn't there. Not yet. Savannah had taken refuge at the lodge longer than she'd planned. After the moment with Ava on the porch, something in her had settled. Not completely, but enough to breathe again. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. Waiting for the noise to fade, the city to stop calling, the image of Jake's face after Charlotte's visit to soften in her mind. He hadn't looked angry. He had looked hurt. Not because of who she was, but because she hadn't trusted him enough to say it. That kind of hurt was harder to face. But Ava's voice when she said, "I don't want you to go," that had lit something inside her. Something fierce, something maternal, something she hadn't let herself want in years. So Savannah decided, no more hiding. She packed her things, left a simple note for the front desk, "Thank you for the quiet," and returned to the farmhouse. By sunset, she was back on the porch, her grandmother's letters beside her, her sketchbook open in her lap. She began drawing the swing Ava had painted, the way it might look when it finally swayed in the breeze. She hadn't even realized he was there until she heard the quiet crunch of gravel. Jake stepped into the golden light, his truck parked askew by the fence. He looked at her for a long beat, then at the sketchbook. "You're back," he said. "I never really left," she replied. He nodded, stepping closer. "Ava painted something. Said she saw this place in a dream. Whole again." Savannah smiled faintly. "She sees things the rest of us are too afraid to hope for." He moved to the edge of the porch, fingers brushing the wood railing they'd repaired together. "You scared her." "I know. And me. I know that too." Jake took a breath. "It's not about the money, Savannah, or the press. I've seen enough of this world to know what matters. It's about the fact that you were here with us, and we thought it was real." "It was real," she said quickly. "I didn't lie about how I felt. I didn't lie about this place. I just wasn't ready to let go of the life I'd built, even if it didn't feel like mine anymore." Jake's eyes softened, but his jaw stayed tight. "And now?" Savannah looked up at him, heart thudding. "Now I want to build something that does." He studied her for a long moment, then stepped onto the porch, sitting beside her. For a while they didn't speak. The crickets had returned, chirping rhythmically in the brush. Somewhere down the hill, a pair of foxes yipped in the distance. "I found my grandmother's journal," Savannah said, breaking the quiet. "She wrote about wanting to turn this place into an art studio for kids who couldn't afford lessons. A sanctuary." Jake raised an eyebrow. "That sounds familiar." "I think she left the dream for me to find when I was ready." Jake looked at her. "Are you?" Savannah nodded. "I want to open it here, with Ava, with you, if you'll let me." His voice was quiet. "You sure you're not running from something?" "I've done enough running," she replied. "I want to run towards something now. This house, this town, you." Jake turned toward her fully. "Then stop waiting." She blinked. "For what?" "For someone to give you permission to stay." And just like that, the air between them shifted. No longer hesitant or guarded. It opened like the sky after a storm. Later that night, Ava tiptoed up the porch steps where Jake and Savannah were still talking by lantern light. Her hair was mussed from sleep, her arms wrapped around a worn blanket. "I couldn't sleep," she mumbled. Jake patted the swing step beside him. "Come here, Peanut." She settled between them, head resting on Jake's shoulder, legs curled up beneath her. Savannah reached out, gently brushing Ava's hair back. "I have a question for you." Ava blinked sleepily. "Okay. And what do you think about turning this place into an art house, where kids from town can come and paint, just like you?" Ava's eyes lit up. "Really? Really?" A pause, then, "Will you still be here?" Savannah met her gaze. "I will." Ava looked over at Jake. "Can she live here forever?" Jake chuckled. "That depends." "On what?" Savannah looked at them both and whispered, "On whether you two are willing to make some room for me." Ava reached for her hand. "We already did." It started with a shovel. Jake stood at the edge of the garden plot behind the farmhouse, his boot pressed against the worn steel, turning over the damp earth. The soil here was richer than he expected, dark and soft beneath the weeds. Life waiting beneath neglect. Savannah knelt a few feet away, gloved hands brushing aside the last of the briars, that had swallowed the rose bushes lining the back fence. Her hair was tied up in a loose knot, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with peace. It had been 3 weeks since the storm, 3 weeks since her world cracked open, and every day since she had stayed. Not as a guest, not as a visitor with her bags half packed. She stayed. The farmhouse had transformed from a memory to a project, then to a dream in motion. Boards had been replaced, beams reinforced, paint stripped and reapplied. The porch now had 2 finished swings, one on each side, and Ava had christened them both with a giant celebratory push from Jake. The dream Savannah's grandmother left behind, to create a safe space for children to create, imagine, and heal, had been lifted from yellow journal pages into blueprints, permits, and purpose. Savannah had filed the paperwork for the nonprofit 2 days earlier. The name came easily, the Painted Porch. That morning, Ava had taken her latest painting and pinned it to the half-repaired kitchen wall. It was simple, just a soft blue sky with 3 figures, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all standing in front of the newly restored farmhouse. Jake had paused to look at it before heading outside. "She got your nose right this time," he teased Savannah, who peeked at the canvas from over his shoulder. "That's because she's secretly a portrait genius," Savannah replied with mock pride. "Don't tell her. It'll go straight to her head." But as Jake turned to leave, he'd caught something else in her expression, something quieter. "Something wrong?" She hesitated. "No, just, I've never built something this personal before." Jake leaned against the doorframe. "That's why it matters." She smiled softly and joined him outside. They worked for hours under the spring sun, breaking only when Ava called out that lunch was ready, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches she'd made herself with meticulous care. The 3 of them ate on the porch steps, legs swinging, the sunlight warm on their backs. Savannah looked over the yard as she chewed thoughtfully. "I want to open on my grandmother's birthday." Jake wiped his hands on a napkin. "That gives us 6 weeks. We can do it." He grinned. "That's the Savannah Monroe I remember from the newspaper, the one who doesn't flinch at impossible deadlines." She looked at him, tone softer now. "This isn't about saving face anymore. This is about saving grace." Jake's eyes didn't leave hers. "I think you already have." In town, word had begun to spread. At first it was curiosity, whispers at the diner, raised eyebrows at the general store. People didn't quite know what to make of the fact that Savannah Monroe, fashion tycoon and once cover model for Forbes, was now hauling wood, scrubbing floors, and sitting cross-legged in the grass teaching kids how to mix paint colors. But when the permits were posted on the town hall bulletin board, and Savannah stood up in front of the Maplewood City Council, in jeans and boots, no press, no entourage, to request approval for the painted porch, the whispers turned into warmth, into welcome. One by one, neighbors showed up with donations, leftover brushes, old art easels, spare lumber, and perhaps most touching, stacks of letters from townspeople who had grown up with nothing and would have given anything for a place like this. One evening, as the sky blushed purple and the crickets tuned their evening symphony, Savannah walked the perimeter of the house alone. The hum of the town had receded. Jake had taken Ava to the bookstore. For the first time in weeks, Savannah had the place to herself. She paused near the side of the house where the old stone path led to what had once been her grandmother's garden. The roses were blooming again, barely shyly, and she reached out to brush her fingers across one of the soft pink petals. She knelt beside the flower bed, breathing in the scent of new growth, and felt it again. That pulse, that sense of something deeper than memory, from the soil, from the bricks, from the wind. It was more than nostalgia. It was belonging. She stood and walked toward the willow tree. The swing had just been finished the day before, red, just like the one from her childhood. Jake had added reinforced chains and sanded the seat smooth. Ava had insisted they all take a turn that morning. Savannah had laughed until her sides hurt, her hair flying wild behind her. Now she sat alone on the swing, rocking gently, her feet brushing the ground. And there, under the sheltering branches, she did something she hadn't allowed herself to do in years. She wept, not from sadness, but from release, From the ache of years spent proving herself, chasing the next headline, always afraid that if she stopped, everything would disappear. But here, in the town no one expected her to return to, with a man who saw through everything, and a little girl who painted with the wisdom of an old soul, she had stopped, and nothing disappeared. In fact, everything had begun. She was still on the swing when Jake returned, Ava asleep in his arms. He paused when he saw her, then walked quietly toward the porch. Savannah stood and followed. Jake tucked Ava into bed on the couch inside, then met Savannah on the porch. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the fields. "I found something," Savannah said, reaching into her pocket. She handed him a small metal key, old, tarnished, with a loop of faded red ribbon. "My grandmother used to wear it on a chain. I found it in the back of her nightstand. There's a chest in the attic I haven't been able to open." Jake turned it over in his fingers. "Want me to help you open it?" Savannah looked up. "Tomorrow." A long pause. Then she stepped closer, and without overthinking, without performance, she reached for his hand. "Jake? Yeah?" She took a breath. "You were the first place I felt safe enough to be quiet in." He didn't answer, just lifted her hand and brought it gently to his chest. And in that stillness, under that moon, Savannah knew. Redemption wasn't about being rescued. It was about choosing to come home. The morning air was laced with the scent of fresh lumber and blooming lilacs. Spring had fully settled into Maplewood, and with it came a quiet sense of purpose that hummed through the farmhouse like electricity before a light flickers on. The windows were wide open. The paint on the front porch was still drying, and inside the once abandoned house, sunlight spilled across floors that had been scrubbed and sanded until they shone. Savannah stood in what had once been her grandmother's dining room, now a makeshift art studio, her bare feet cool against the hardwood. Easels lined the walls, each one prepped with a clean canvas. A long wooden table, salvaged and refinished by Jake himself, sat in the center, stocked with jars of brushes, palettes, and mason jars full of water dyed faintly blue and green. Ava danced into the room, holding a small cardboard sign covered in glitter and uneven lettering. "It's ready," she beamed. "Can I hang it outside?" Savannah took the sign, brushing a few sparkles off her shirt. "The painted porch, art, hope, and cookies." She smiled. "You forgot the free part." Ava shrugged. "Hope is already free." Savannah bent to kiss the top of her head. "Yes, it is. Now go ask Jake for a hammer." Ava ran off, hair streaming behind her. Savannah turned back to the room and let herself absorb it. The color, the calm, the quiet miracle of how far they'd come. The grand opening was still weeks away, but today would be a soft start. Just a handful of children from the local school coming for an afternoon of color and cookies. Not a gala, not a press release, just art. Just life, just right. Jake arrived a little after noon, carrying 2 trays of lemon bars and peanut butter cookies made from his mother's recipe. The only one he ever bothered to memorize. His flannel sleeves were rolled up, his beard trimmed, and there was sawdust in his hair. He looked, Savannah thought, like someone who belonged exactly where he was. "You nervous?" he asked, setting the trays down on the kitchen counter. Savannah leaned against the doorframe, watching him. Less nervous, more expectant. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Like when you know something is about to begin. Not something big and noisy, something good." He nodded, glancing toward the studio. "It's beautiful, Savannah. You did it." She looked at him, warmth rising in her chest. "We did," Jake smiled. "Yeah, I guess we did." They shared a quiet moment, one of many they'd come to treasure. No need to fill the space with words. Just the knowledge that they were building something side by side. The children arrived just after 1, parents dropping them off with cautious glances that turned into curious smiles as they stepped inside. Most were between 6 and 10, nervous, giggly, some clutching little lunch boxes or scraps of paper they'd drawn at home. Savannah greeted each one personally, Ava acting as an unofficial hostess, proudly explaining which brushes were best for clouds and which ones for grass. Jake lingered nearby, fixing a crooked shelf and refilling lemonade pitchers. He was never the center of attention, but always at the center of everything that worked. The room filled with laughter, brush strokes, and the unmistakable smell of tempera paint. Savannah floated from easel to easel, gently encouraging, complimenting, offering a hand here, a smile there. And something else happened too. The children, some shy, some wide-eyed, began painting things they hadn't meant to say aloud. One girl painted a picture of a small yellow house, saying it reminded her of the one her mom used to live in before they moved into an apartment. A boy painted a dog he hadn't seen in months, his father's, who'd left with the divorce. Ava painted the sky, of course, and the porch. And in the corner, a red heart cradled in two outstretched hands. Savannah had to excuse herself for a moment, pretending to refill a water jar just to breathe through the lump in her throat. This wasn't just art, it was memory, hope, and truth coming alive in color. Her grandmother would have called it soul work. By late afternoon, the children began to pack up, each left with a cookie, a small canvas wrapped in paper, and cheeks flushed with pride. Parents came to collect them, many lingering to ask when the next session would be. A few offered to volunteer. One local teacher asked if she could bring her entire fourth grade class next month. Savannah took it all in like sunlight, eyes wide, heart full. As the last child left, Ava helped Jake close the front gate, then returned to the porch where Savannah stood with a clipboard, organizing the sign-up sheets. Ava tugged at her sleeve. "Can we keep doing this forever?" Savannah crouched. "As long as there are kids who need to paint, we'll be here." Ava grinned and ran off to fetch her latest painting to hang on the drying wall. Jake came up behind her, brushing his hand lightly across her shoulder. "You okay?" Savannah turned to him. "Better than okay." He studied her face. "You look like you belong here." "I do," she said. "And not just in this house, in this." She gestured to the walls, to the porch, to the fading footprints on the hardwood floor where children had stood. "In all of it." Jake's expression softened. "I knew you did. I just had to wait for you to know it too." Savannah took his hand, then hesitated. "There's something else." He looked down at her, expectant. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her back pocket. A deed, signed, sealed. "I'm transferring ownership of the house into the name of the foundation. It's not mine anymore. It's ours and the town's, the kids', yours and Ava's too." Jake took the paper, reading it slowly. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "You're giving it away." "I'm giving it purpose," she said. "The money I came from, it built empires. But this builds people." Jake looked at her then, really looked, as if he were seeing her for the first time all over again. "I want to ask you something," he said softly. She raised her eyebrows. "It's not a question with words yet," he said, "but I think it will be soon." Savannah laughed through the emotion building in her throat. "Then I'll wait. Just don't take too long." He smiled. "I won't." That night, when the stars spilled across the sky like scattered salt and the wind rustled through the porch chimes, Savannah sat in the swing under the willow tree. Ava was asleep inside. Jake sat beside her, their hands lightly touching, fingers intertwined like roots beneath new soil. No cameras, no headlines. Just the start of something good. And for the first time in years, Savannah wasn't chasing anything. She had already arrived. The morning unfolded with quiet joy. There were no banners, no confetti, no headlines, only the soft clatter of paint jars being arranged on the long table, the scent of warm muffins wafting from the oven, and the hum of life finding its rhythm again inside the old farmhouse. Savannah stood barefoot in the kitchen, tying a faded apron around her waist. The sun filtered through the window panes, casting golden squares of light onto the floor. On the counter sat a bouquet of wildflowers Ava had picked from the field that morning. Daces, buttercups, and something purple Savannah couldn't name. It was her grandmother's birthday, and today the painted porch would officially open. Not with flash or flare, but with heart, exactly the way Clara Monroe would have wanted. Savannah had spent the past week poring over every detail, confirming the guest list, setting up the easel displays, even baking the lemon muffins from her grandmother's handwritten recipe. It had all come together in a way that felt less like effort and more like alignment, as though the house itself had finally exhaled and decided to live again. By noon, the porch was buzzing. Neighbors arrived with folding chairs and casserole dishes. Children ran barefoot through the grass, squealing with delight as they chased bubbles across the field. A small string trio, made up of high school students from the nearby county, played under the willow tree. Their melodies floated on the breeze, light and warm. Jake stood near the entrance, in a crisp button-up shirt and clean jeans, looking both out of place and entirely at home. His hair was neatly combed, but he still carried the scent of cedar and fresh sawdust, his version of cologne. He was holding Ava's hand as they made their way through the crowd, stopping now and then to greet friends and thank volunteers. Ava beamed at everyone, proudly introducing them to "my new mom's art house," and no one corrected her, because in every way that mattered, she was right. Savannah watched them from the doorway, her heart tightening in the way it does when something feels too big for words. She had known love before, or thought she had. Polished, ambitious love, the kind that made for good photos and strategic alliances. But this was different. It was simpler, deeper, like standing barefoot in the soil and feeling the earth hum beneath your feet. The ceremony began just after 2 p.m. Savannah stepped onto the porch, microphone in hand, flanked by 2 rows of canvas paintings created by children from the first few weeks of classes. She looked out over the small sea of folding chairs, the faces smiling up at her. Kind, familiar, weathered, new. "I'm not very good at speeches," she began, earning a few chuckles from the crowd. Which is funny, considering how many rooms I've stood in and how many microphones I've held. She glanced down for a moment, then up again. But today's different, because this house isn't about announcements or launches or brand identity. It's about returning to joy, to memory, to who we were before the world told us to be something else. She paused, eyes finding Ava and Jake in the front row. This house belonged to a woman who believed in the power of small things. A warm meal, a good story, a painting pinned to the fridge. She believed that healing wasn't loud or linear. It was slow and soft, and it happened in places where people were safe to be themselves. Savannah's voice caught slightly. She steadied. "I didn't come here to fix anything, but somewhere along the way, I realized I was the one being healed." She stepped back to a round of gentle, heartfelt applause. After the ceremony, people wandered through the house, admiring the children's artwork, nibbling on homemade treats, and taking turns on the newly finished porch swings. Savannah stood near the garden, chatting with a couple who had driven in from the next town. She was just about to refill their lemonade when Ava ran up, tugging her hand excitedly. "Come on," she whispered. "It's time." Savannah blinked. "Time for what?" Ava only grinned. "You'll see." Jake was standing beneath the willow tree, where the music had faded and the breeze had picked up slightly, sending dappled light dancing across the grass. He looked almost nervous, a rare sight, but when Savannah stepped into view, his face softened. The crowd, sensing something, had begun to gather loosely nearby. Conversations quieted. A few people pulled out their phones, though most just watched with quiet expectancy. Jake cleared his throat. "So, I didn't plan this part very well." Savannah raised an eyebrow, both amused and completely unaware. He looked down at Ava, who handed him something. A small canvas, edges still drying. Jake held it up. Painted in careful, childlike strokes were 3 figures: a man, a woman, and a little girl standing in front of the farmhouse. But now the woman wore white, and the man was on one knee. Savannah gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Jake turned to her, taking something small from his pocket. A simple ring with a stone the color of wild honey. Not flashy, just right. "I've never needed a perfect moment," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I know when something feels true. And this, you, Ava, this house, it feels more real than anything I've known." He stepped closer. "I didn't fall in love with your name or your story. I fell in love with the way you show up, with the way you care, with the way you changed my daughter's life and mine." Savannah's eyes filled with tears. Jake held up the ring. "So what do you think? Want to stay a little longer?" The silence was only a heartbeat, but it felt like a lifetime. Then Savannah laughed. Not a small, polite sound, but the kind that rose from somewhere deep, unburdened and whole. She nodded, eyes shining. "Yes." The crowd erupted in cheers. Ava clapped so hard her painted canvas fell from her hands. Jake stood and slipped the ring onto Savannah's finger. then kissed her, slow and certain, beneath the willow tree where it had all begun. That night, after the guests had gone and the lantern swayed softly on the porch, Savannah sat with Jake and Ava on the front steps, a blanket draped across their legs, a half-empty pie tin balanced between them. The stars hung low and bright above the field. Ava leaned against Savannah's side. "Does this mean we're a family now?" Savannah kissed the top of her head. "We always were." Jake took her hand. "Just needed a little paint to see it." Savannah looked out across the fields, the porch lights glowing warm behind them, the swing creaking gently in the breeze. Home wasn't a place, it was a painting you didn't know you were part of, until one day you stepped back, looked around, and realized the colors had always been yours. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next inspiring story we share here. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Until next time, take care, be kind, and remember, sometimes the smallest acts of love create the most beautiful endings.